What kind of mother sells her past so her child can purchase a future and never asks to be thanked for it? Before I tell you what happened at that wedding, you need to understand what came before it, because humiliation doesn't begin in a hallway behind a kitchen. It begins years earlier in quiet decisions no one ever claps for, decisions made in silence, with love as the only witness. I was born into land, not wealth, land that carried stories, land that remembered footsteps, land my grandmother used to say was the only thing that never forgot who you were. And for generations, my family in Jamaica held on to it not because it made us rich, but because it made us rooted, because when everything else was uncertain, that land said, you belong somewhere. I built my life the same way, slow, steady, dignified, teaching children, tending a small home, believing that if you poured goodness into the world, it would somehow come back to you. And the greatest place I poured it was into my daughter, my only child, the center of every dream I ever postponed. From the time she was small, I told her she could go anywhere, be anything, even if it meant she would someday go far from me. Because I believed a mother's love wasn't measured by how tightly she held on, but by how bravely she let go. When she was accepted into an American university, the kind people whispered about like it was a miracle. I smiled and celebrated and told everyone how proud I was. But what I didn't tell anyone was the number I saw on the tuition letter, a number so large it didn't feel real, a number that quietly asked a question I never said out loud. What are you willing to give up for her future? I walked that land alone before I sold it, felt the soil between my fingers, remembered my father's laugh, my mother's hands, the way the breeze moved through the trees at sunset, and I told myself that memories don't disappear just because paperwork changes, that love is more valuable than property, that one day my daughter would understand what it cost and love me even more for it. I never told her the truth, not because I was ashamed, but because sacrifice, to me, was never a bargaining chip. It was just what mothers did. And when she built her life in America, graduated, moved into circles I only saw on television, I told myself every lonely evening had been worth it. Then she fell in love, and when she called to tell me about the wedding, I heard something different in her voice. Not excitement, but urgency. As if the day wasn't about love, but about proving something to people whose approval mattered more than she admitted. She talked about venues, names I'd never heard before, places that sounded less like buildings and more like statements. And when she told me the cost, I felt that same quiet question rise again, the one I had answered once already. And just like before, I didn't hesitate, because how could I say no to the child I had already given everything to? I sold what little I had left of my savings, wired money across the ocean, watched numbers disappear from my account, and told myself it wasn't loss. It was legacy, that this wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was proof that everything I'd done had worked. But then there were small moments, the kind you brush aside because facing them feels harder than ignoring them. Comments about colors, about appearances, about how certain things might look to their guests. Pauses where warmth should have been. A subtle distancing that I explained away as stress, because admitting the truth would have meant asking myself a painful question. When did my daughter start seeing where she came from as something to hide? I packed my suitcase with care, chose a dress that made me feel dignified, not flashy, not apologetic, just myself. And as I boarded that plane from Jamaica to Atlanta, I carried pride heavier than my luggage, believing I was flying toward one of the proudest moments of my life, believing that no matter how big her world had become, there would still be a place in it for me. What I didn't realize then was that the sacrifices we make quietly are often the easiest ones for others to forget. That love given without conditions is sometimes mistaken for something disposable, and that the very things we give up to lift someone higher can become the reason they no longer want us seen beside them. And as the plane lifted off the runway, I told myself a mother's role was to stand behind her child, to support, to blend into the background if necessary, never imagining that those words would soon take on a meaning so literal, so cruel, that it would change the way I understood love, dignity, and silence forever. Because the first warning didn't come at the wedding, it came in a single sentence she said to me on the phone, a sentence I ignored, and that decision would cost me more than anything I had ever sold. Have you ever felt the moment someone you love quietly edits you out of their life? Not with cruelty, but with tone, with pauses, with carefully chosen words that leave no bruises but still manage to hurt. That realization didn't arrive for me at the wedding hall. It crept in earlier, disguised as logistics and planning calls, hidden behind phrases like just a small detail. And you understand, right? The kind of language people use when they don't want to sound ungrateful but still need you to know your presence must be controlled. Our phone conversations changed as the wedding approached. No longer warm, wandering talks about life and memories, but clipped checklists, rushed updates, and subtle corrections that made me feel as if I were being prepared, not invited. And when I mentioned the dress I had made back home, something elegant and dignified that made me feel like myself, there was a pause so long I could hear my own breathing, followed by a careful suggestion about color palettes and themes, about how everything needed to match, about how the wedding would be filled with important people who noticed details. Important people, she said, not family, not elders, not those who had loved her before she had anything to offer the world, but people whose approval she had learned to chase. People I would never meet except as a background figure in photographs she hoped would circulate in the right circles. I laughed it off, told her she sounded stressed, told myself that brides worry about everything, and that it was my job to be easy, to be adaptable, to never become a burden, because I had taught her to succeed, not to stop for me. But the truth was, each conversation left me feeling slightly smaller, slightly more cautious about what I said, how I sounded, how I might be perceived, as if my accent, my simplicity, my very history needed to be softened so it wouldn't clash with the image she was constructing. There was a moment, one I replayed later in my mind with painful clarity, when she said, almost absent mindedly, just don't draw too much attention, okay? I want everything to feel seamless. And I smiled and agreed, because I didn't yet understand that seamless meant invisible, that harmony meant erasure, and that love, in her world now, had conditions I had never placed on it. I told myself I was overthinking, that sacrifice sometimes meant stepping back, that mothers weren't meant to be the center of their children's milestones, but somewhere deep inside, a question whispered, when did being proud of where you came from become something to manage? Still, I packed carefully, folding my clothes as if neatness could protect me, rehearsing smiles in the mirror, reminding myself that my role was to witness, not to demand, to celebrate, not to complicate. And as I boarded that plane, I carried not just excitement, but a quiet resolve to be exactly what she needed me to be, even if it meant shrinking. The city greeted me with glass and speed, with buildings that didn't look at you so much as past you. And in my hotel room, surrounded by polished surfaces and unfamiliar silence, I practiced composure like it was a skill I needed to master, telling myself that this was her world now and I was simply visiting. On the morning of the wedding, as I dressed carefully, smoothing fabric, steadying my hands, I told my reflection that dignity was something you carried within you, not something granted by seating charts or introductions, that no matter where I stood, I would still be her mother, still be the woman who had made all of this possible. But even then, there were signs, messages left unread, instructions relayed through others, a sense that my presence was being managed rather than welcomed, and each one chipped away at the certainty I'd brought with me from home. I tried to remember the girl who used to run barefoot through the yard, who used to cling to my side when storms rolled in. And I wondered when that girl learned that success required distance, that belonging could be conditional, that origins could be inconvenient. The truth I wasn't ready to face yet was simple and devastating. Somewhere along the way, my daughter had started measuring herself against people who would never know what it cost to raise her, and in doing so, she had begun to see me not as her foundation, but as a reminder of a version of herself she was afraid others would judge. I told myself love was patient, that understanding would come later, that once the stress passed, she would soften again, that this was just a phase in the whirlwind of planning and pressure. What I didn't know then was that these small moments weren't accidents, they were rehearsals, that every correction, every distancing comment, every polite dismissal was preparing me for something far more deliberate, something she had already decided but hadn't yet found the courage to say out loud. And as I left my hotel room that afternoon, heart full of hope and quiet unease, I still believed the ceremony would reset everything, that once vows were spoken and music played, there would be no room left for shame. I didn't know that the real test wasn't whether I would be welcomed. It was how far she was willing to go to make sure I wasn't seen at all. And I was about to find out the moment I asked a stranger to show me to my seat. Have you ever walked into a place so beautiful it makes you feel smaller instead of inspired, as if the shine itself is asking whether you belong there? The journey from my island home to that wedding venue felt like moving between two worlds that were never meant to touch. One built on memory and endurance, the other on display and approval. And somewhere between the airplane cabin and the taxi ride through Atlanta, I felt myself becoming a guest not just in a city, but in my own daughter's life. The airport was all motion and impatience, people moving with purpose, eyes fixed on screens and schedules, and as I followed the signs and waited for my luggage, I became acutely aware of my pace, my accent, the way I carried myself. Things I had never questioned before because back home they were simply me. The taxi ride into the city felt like passing through a catalog of ambition, towers of glass reflecting sunlight, streets named after people I'd never heard of, neighborhoods where every corner whispered money. And I watched it all through the window with a mix of awe and unease, telling myself that this was the world my sacrifices had helped build, that I should feel proud, even if I felt out of place. My hotel room was elegant and quiet, too quiet, with views that stretched far but felt oddly empty. And as I unpacked, I laid my dress across the bed like a promise to myself that no matter where I was, I would show up as who I was, not as who I thought they wanted me to be. I rehearsed calm, practiced gratitude, reminded myself that weddings are chaotic, that feelings run high, that a mother's job is to absorb stress so her child doesn't have to. And when the time came to leave for the venue, I took a deep breath and stepped into the afternoon, believing that the hardest part was behind me. The drive to the venue felt like a slow reveal, the city giving way to quieter streets, larger homes, manicured lawns so perfect they looked unreal. And when the car turned onto a long, curving driveway lined with trees, my heart lifted despite everything. Because there it was, the place my daughter had dreamed of. A building so grand it seemed to announce itself before you even reached the door. White columns rose against the sky, the entrance framed like a promise. And for a moment, pride drowned out doubt as I thought, I helped make this happen. I helped give her this. I paid the driver, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the entrance with my head held high, reminding myself that I belonged here as much as anyone, that love, not wealth, was the real ticket inside. The doors opened to a rush of sound and light, marble floors reflecting chandeliers, voices layered over soft music, arrangements of flowers so perfect they looked staged for a magazine. And I felt a flicker of joy imagining my daughter somewhere inside, radiant, happy, about to begin a new chapter. I expected to see her, or at least someone who knew who I was, someone who would smile and say welcome. But instead, I was greeted by a woman with a clipboard and a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And as I gave my name, there was a pause, a glance downward. A moment so small it would have been easy to miss if my senses hadn't already been sharpened by weeks of subtle distance. She nodded, pleasant but distant, and told me my daughter was busy with final touches, that she would show me to my seat, and I followed, heels clicking softly on the floor, telling myself this was normal, that ceremonies are carefully orchestrated, that there was no reason to feel the tightness forming in my chest. We passed doorways that offered glimpses of the main hall, rows of chairs aligned with precision, flowers spilling over pedestals, guests chatting easily, and with every step, my anticipation grew, because surely we were heading there, surely I would take my place and everything would settle into something familiar. But instead of turning toward the music, we continued down a quieter corridor, the sounds of celebration fading behind us, the light changing, the air growing warmer, and I felt a flicker of confusion that quickly turned into something sharper, because instinct told me this was wrong. The hallway seemed to stretch longer than it should have, each step pulling me further away from what I'd imagined. And when we stopped in front of a set of swinging doors, the kind used by staff, not guests, I felt my heart begin to race, my mind scrambling for explanations that made sense. The doors swung open, releasing a mix of heat and unfamiliar smells, and suddenly the elegance fell away, replaced by stainless steel, tile, and the unmistakable presence of a working kitchen. And before I could speak, before I could ask the question forming in my throat, I saw it, a single chair tucked beside large metal bins, placed just out of sight, just out of reach, just far enough away that no one would have to acknowledge it. Time seemed to slow as my eyes moved from the chair to the bins and back again, my mind refusing to connect what I was seeing with what it meant. Because this couldn't be for me. This had to be a mistake, some temporary stop before being escorted to the right place. I opened my mouth to speak, to correct the error, to laugh it off, but the woman with the clipboard spoke first, her tone firm, practiced, final, and in that moment, as realization began to creep in, I felt something shift inside me, something fragile cracking under the weight of understanding. The pride I'd carried from Jamaica, the belief that love guaranteed belonging, the certainty that sacrifice would be honored. All of it wavered as I stood there, suspended between disbelief and dread, knowing I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't yet name but would never forget. And just as I tried to steady myself, just as I prepared to ask for my daughter, the music swelled somewhere far away, signaling the ceremony was about to begin. And I realized with a cold clarity that whatever this was, it wasn't temporary. Because the next face I saw wasn't a stranger with a clipboard. It was my daughter's, and the words she spoke to me in that hallway would change everything I thought I knew about who I was to her. Have you ever felt your stomach drop not because something bad happened, but because something finally made sense? The moment I stood there in that quiet corridor, with the celebration pulsing faintly through the walls and the scent of food replacing the perfume of flowers, a truth I had been avoiding began to settle into my bones. Because this was not confusion, this was choreography, and I was being guided not toward honor, but away from sight. I asked, softly at first, whether there had been a mistake, whether perhaps we'd taken a wrong turn, and the woman with the clipboard didn't look surprised or uncertain. She looked prepared, like someone repeating instructions they had been given clearly and without room for interpretation. And when she told me this was where I was assigned, her voice carried no apology, only efficiency. Assigned? The word echoed in my head as I looked again at the chair, placed just far enough from the door that anyone entering the kitchen wouldn't trip over it, but close enough to the bins that the message was unmistakable. And for a moment, I stood there unable to move, because my mind refused to accept what my eyes already understood. I told her I was the mother of the bride, that surely there had been some oversight, that my place would be near the front, and she nodded politely and repeated that she was following the seating plan provided. Nothing more, nothing less. And then, with a small professional smile, she wished me an enjoyable ceremony and walked away, leaving me alone in a space that was never meant for waiting, only for passing through. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant swell of music and the clatter of activity behind the kitchen doors. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so humiliating could feel so unreal, as if I were watching it happen to someone else. I stood there longer than I care to admit, expecting at any moment for laughter to break the tension, for someone to appear and say there had been a misunderstanding, for my daughter to come running, embarrassed but apologetic, ready to take my hand and lead me where I belonged. But the music grew louder, the ceremony began, and no one came. When she finally appeared, it wasn't with relief or concern, but with urgency and irritation, her dress immaculate, her face carefully composed. And as she reached for my arm, her grip was tight, not comforting, and she pulled me further into the shadow of the corridor as if shielding me from view. She spoke quickly, her words clipped, explaining that there had been last-minute changes, that important guests had arrived unexpectedly, that there simply wasn't space, and that this was the best solution, her eyes darting toward the hall as if afraid someone might see us. I asked her quietly why I was back there, why I couldn't sit inside like everyone else. And the way she answered told me more than her words ever could, because she didn't say my name, didn't meet my eyes, didn't apologize. She just told me not to make a scene, told me I understood how these things worked, told me it was only for a little while, as if time could soften the meaning of being hidden. In that instant, something inside me broke open, not with sound or tears, but with a sharp, blinding clarity, because I realized this wasn't about space or logistics or stress. It was about image, about who she wanted visible in that room and who she wanted concealed. And I, her mother, did not fit the picture she had so carefully curated. I looked at her, really looked at her, at the woman she had become, wrapped in elegance and urgency, and I struggled to find the girl who once reached for me without shame, the girl who used to introduce me proudly to anyone who would listen. And in that struggle, grief rose up so quickly it stole my breath. She told me it was either this or nothing, that she needed me to cooperate, and those words landed like a verdict, reducing my presence to a problem to be managed rather than a person to be honored. I nodded because arguing felt pointless, because making a scene would only confirm the fear she already had, that I didn't belong there. And as she turned and disappeared back into the light, I was left standing with the echo of her footsteps and the sudden understanding that the distance between us was no longer measured in miles, but in values. I sat down slowly, the chair cold beneath me, my hands folded in my lap as if posture could preserve dignity. And as the vows began somewhere beyond the doors, I listened to them through layers of sound and silence, each word a reminder of the love being celebrated without me. Guests passed through occasionally, staff moving with practiced indifference, their eyes sliding past me as if I were part of the wall, and with every minute that passed, the reality of my situation sank deeper, not as shock anymore, but as humiliation carefully designed to go unnoticed. I was not meant to complain, not meant to interrupt, not meant to exist beyond that narrow space. And as I sat there, hidden in plain sight, I realized this was the moment my role in her life had been quietly, decisively rewritten. Because the ceremony was only the beginning, and what followed, hours of being erased, ignored, and treated as an inconvenience, would force me to confront a truth far more painful than the seating itself. That love, when mixed with shame, can turn even a mother into something disposable. What does it do to a person when they realize they haven't just been overlooked, but deliberately placed where no one is meant to look? Sitting there beside those bins, I finally understood that this wasn't about a chair or a hallway. It was about erasure, about taking someone who had given everything and deciding they should exist only on the edges, unseen and unacknowledged. The ceremony continued beyond the doors, vows exchanged, applause rising and falling like waves I could hear but never touch. And as I sat there, hands folded, back straight, I felt myself split in two, one part listening for familiar voices, the other trying desperately to remain composed as the reality of my position settled in. The smell of food grew stronger as dishes were prepared and cleared, a constant reminder that this space was designed for service, not celebration, and every time the doors swung open, I flinched, hoping irrationally that someone might notice me and ask why I was there. No one did. The staff moved quickly, efficiently, their focus on tasks, not people, and when their eyes passed over me, it was with the same blankness reserved for fixtures and equipment, as if acknowledging me would disrupt the smooth functioning of the day. I told myself to breathe, to remember who I was, to hold on to the knowledge that my worth didn't depend on where I sat, but it was difficult to maintain that certainty when everything around me seemed designed to contradict it. Through a narrow opening in the doors, I caught fleeting glimpses of the reception hall, of guests laughing, glasses raised, music swelling, and with each glimpse came a fresh wave of disbelief. Because this joy was built on sacrifices that now felt invisible, as if the foundation had been buried so deeply that no one remembered it existed. I watched my daughter from afar, radiant and smiling, moving through the room with confidence, and the distance between us felt vast, not just physically, but emotionally, because she did not once look toward the place where I sat, did not search for my face, did not pause as if something were missing. Time stretched in strange ways, minutes feeling like hours, hours blurring together as the celebration unfolded without me, and somewhere in that stretch of waiting, shock gave way to something heavier, something that pressed down on my chest until each breath felt deliberate. This was not a misunderstanding that would be corrected, not a momentary lapse that would be apologized for later. This was a choice being reinforced with every passing minute, a decision to let me remain where I was because acknowledging me would be inconvenient. I felt the weight of everything I had given, years of work, land sold, savings emptied, love poured out without reservation. And I wondered how it was possible for someone to accept all of that and still decide their own mother was a liability. The bins beside me were emptied and refilled, plates scraped, glasses clinked, the ordinary sounds of cleanup creating a rhythm that marked the passage of time more clearly than the music ever could. And with each scrape and clang, the symbolism grew harder to ignore. I was seated where things were discarded, where leftovers went, where messes were hidden away so the front of the house could remain pristine, and the realization settled over me with brutal clarity. This was exactly how she wanted to present me, out of sight, out of mind, part of what needed to be concealed for the illusion to hold. I felt tears threaten, not the kind that come with loud sobs, but the quiet kind that blur your vision and make your throat ache, and I fought them fiercely. Because crying there would have felt like confirming the role I had been assigned. Instead, I focused on small things: the texture of my dress beneath my fingers, the sound of my own breathing, the memory of my garden back home. Anything that could anchor me to myself in a place that seemed intent on stripping that away. As the reception continued, laughter grew louder, speeches were made, applause echoed, and each sound carried a sting sharper than the last, because I was close enough to hear it all, but far enough to be excluded from its meaning. I was not a guest, not a participant, not even an inconvenience to be addressed. I was simply there, tolerated in silence, and that realization hurt more than anger ever could. Somewhere deep inside, a question formed that would not go away. How does a mother become something her own child is ashamed to be seen with? I replayed memories, searching for answers, wondering if I had missed signs, if I had failed in ways I couldn't yet name, but no matter how hard I searched, nothing justified what was happening now. And as the hours passed, as I remained seated beside what was meant to be hidden, I felt something shift within me, a slow transformation from disbelief to resolve. Because humiliation can either break you or sharpen you. And in that narrow space, surrounded by reminders of what had been discarded, I began to understand that this moment, as painful as it was, would not be the end of my story. Because just when I thought I had become invisible to everyone, one small act of kindness from a stranger would remind me that dignity cannot be thrown away, and that reminder would change everything that came next. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the person who saves you isn't the one who owes you anything, but the one who sees you when everyone else has decided not to? By the time he appeared, I had learned the rhythm of that hallway, the swing of the doors, the scrape of plates, the way the celebration surged and receded like a tide I was never meant to enter, and I had settled into a kind of quiet endurance that felt less like patience and more like survival. Then the doors opened again, and a young man stepped out carrying a tray of empty glasses, his movements quick, practiced, and when his eyes landed on me, they didn't slide past the way everyone else's had, they stopped, widened, and in that pause I felt something I hadn't felt all afternoon: recognition. He glanced from me to the bins beside my chair, then back to my face, and whatever professional mask he had been wearing fell away, replaced by an expression of disbelief so open it almost startled me, as if the situation itself had offended him. He set the tray down carefully, as though suddenly aware that noise mattered, and approached me slowly, lowering himself slightly so we were at eye level. His voice gentle, respectful, the kind of tone you use when you know you are standing in the presence of someone who deserves better. He apologized, not for anything he had done, but for what I was enduring, and that apology, offered without obligation or benefit, struck me harder than any insult that had come before. He asked if I was all right, if I needed water, if there was anything he could do. And when he placed a glass in my hands, cool and solid, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen just enough for breath to come easier. I wanted to thank him, to explain, to say something that made sense of the absurdity of it all, but my voice failed me, and all I could manage was a nod, a small smile, a silent acknowledgement of his kindness. He didn't push, didn't ask questions, didn't try to fix what he couldn't. He simply treated me like a person, and in that simple act, he gave me back something I didn't realize had been taken: my sense of worth. As he stood to leave, he squeezed my arm gently, a brief human gesture that said more than words ever could. And when the doors closed behind him, the hallway felt different, not warmer, not kinder, but clearer. The contrast between his compassion and my daughter's calculated distance was impossible to ignore, and in that contrast, grief began to burn away, replaced by something sharper, something steadier, something that felt like resolve. I realized then that what hurt most wasn't the chair, or the bins, or the hours of waiting. It was the knowledge that a stranger had shown me more respect, in a minute, than my own child had shown me all day. That realization could have crushed me, could have sent me spiraling into bitterness, but instead it did something unexpected. It clarified everything. I stopped asking why this was happening and started asking what I would do next, because there comes a point when understanding someone else's choices matters less than deciding how you will respond to them. I sat there longer, but no longer in shock, no longer hoping for rescue, no longer measuring my worth by the doors that stayed closed. And as the celebration wound down and the noise began to thin, I felt a calm settle over me that surprised even myself. The young man's kindness had reminded me that dignity is not something granted by family or status or proximity to power. It is something you carry, something no one can strip away unless you let them. And in remembering that, I felt a quiet strength return. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and for the first time since arriving at the venue, I allowed myself to see the situation clearly, not through the lens of hurt, but through the lens of truth. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding to be smoothed over later. It was a deliberate choice rooted in shame and fear, and acknowledging that freed me from the need to protect anyone else's feelings at the expense of my own. I didn't confront my daughter, didn't make a scene, didn't demand an explanation, because in that moment, silence felt more powerful than words, and patience felt more strategic than anger. I knew then that whatever came next would not be loud or messy or impulsive. It would be precise, intentional, and rooted in self respect because I had spent too many years building a life of dignity to let it be dismantled in a single afternoon. As the hallway emptied and the last guests moved toward the exit, I rose slowly from the chair, no longer feeling like something that had been discarded, but like someone who had learned an important truth under difficult circumstances. Because while they thought this story ended with me hidden and humiliated, the truth was that this was only the moment I stopped being invisible and the decision I made next would change the entire narrative. Have you ever reached a moment where anger feels too small, where shouting would only cheapen what you've endured, and silence suddenly becomes the sharpest tool you own? That was the moment I stood in when I left that hallway, not storming out, not demanding explanations, but walking away with a calm so deliberate it felt almost foreign, because something fundamental had shifted inside me. I didn't look for my daughter, didn't wait for an apology that was never coming, didn't linger in hopes that someone might finally realize what had been done, because I understood then that acknowledgement from them would change nothing and that dignity reclaimed does not require permission. I walked past the main hall one last time, the music still playing, laughter spilling out into the corridors. And for the first time, none of it pulled at me, none of it tempted me to re enter a space where my presence had been treated as an inconvenience. Instead, I felt a strange clarity, the kind that comes when grief has burned itself out and left behind something harder and more focused. And as I moved through the venue, I began to notice details I hadn't before. Things that would soon matter far more than seating arrangements or speeches. Near the entrance, there was a table where guests had signed their names. A carefully arranged display meant to capture memories, and beside it, almost unnoticed, lay a small stack of business cards. Their clean edges and understated design catching my eye not because of what they promised, but because of what they represented documentation, permanence, proof. I picked one up, feeling the weight of it between my fingers, and in that simple act, a plan began to take shape, not born of revenge, but of truth. Because there is a difference between wanting to hurt someone and wanting the truth to be seen. And I was no longer interested in hiding anything. I left the venue without ceremony, stepping back into the open air with a sense of finality that surprised me, as if I had closed a door that no longer deserved my energy. And when I returned to my hotel room, I didn't cry or pace or replay conversations. I sat down, breathed deeply, and allowed myself to think. The city outside my window hummed with activity, but inside there was stillness, the kind that precedes action. And as I considered everything that had happened, I realized that what hurt most was not the public humiliation, but the assumption behind it that I would accept it quietly and disappear. That assumption, more than anything else, demanded a response, not to punish, but to correct, to remind everyone involved that respect is not optional, especially when it comes to those who laid the groundwork for your success. I slept that night without nightmares, without tears, my mind already organizing itself around what needed to be done. And when morning came, it arrived not with despair, but with purpose. I dressed simply, deliberately, choosing comfort over symbolism. And as I sat at the small desk in my room, the business card lay beside me like a key waiting to be used. I thought about the years I had spent teaching, about the authority that comes not from volume, but from consistency, from clarity, from knowing when to speak and when to wait. And I understood that this situation required the same measured approach. I wasn't going to argue about feelings or intentions, wasn't going to beg for understanding from people who had already shown me who they were. I was going to deal in facts, in actions, in records that could not be dismissed as emotion. The decision I made then was quiet, almost mundane on the surface, but its implications were anything but, because it marked the moment I stopped framing myself as a wronged mother and started acting as a woman who understood her own value. I didn't rehearse speeches or plan confrontations. I planned logistics, timing, steps that would unfold calmly and inevitably, because the most powerful responses are often the least dramatic ones. As I reached for the phone, my hand steady, my thoughts clear, I knew that whatever came next would not restore the relationship I thought I had with my daughter, but it would restore something far more important: the balance between who I was and how I allowed myself to be treated. And with that realization, I dialed a number that would turn a hidden humiliation into something impossible to ignore, setting in motion a chain of events no one at that wedding had seen coming. Have you ever realized that the truth doesn't need to be shouted to be devastating? That sometimes all it needs is to be seen clearly, without explanation or apology. That understanding guided every thought I had as the plan I'd quietly formed began to take shape. Because I wasn't interested in drama or confrontation, I was interested in accuracy, in preserving what had happened exactly as it was, stripped of excuses and softened narratives. When I made that call, my voice was calm, measured, the voice of someone conducting business rather than pleading a case. And I introduced myself not as a hurt mother, but as someone commissioning work, because how you frame yourself determines how others respond to you. I explained that I wanted a private project, something separate, something intentional, and as I spoke, I could sense the shift on the other end of the line, the subtle recalibration that happens when someone realizes they are being invited into something serious. I didn't recount the humiliation in emotional terms, didn't describe tears or betrayal. I described a scene, a setting, a moment that deserved to be documented. Because moments like that have a way of being dismissed when they rely on memory alone. Arrangements were made efficiently, professionally, without gossip or commentary. And when I hung up the phone, I felt a quiet satisfaction not because I anticipated vindication, but because I knew the story would no longer belong solely to those who wanted it hidden. Returning to the venue later felt surreal, the grandeur subdued now that the guests were gone, the rooms echoing with absence instead of music. And as I walked back through the same corridors, I noticed how different everything felt when you weren't trying to earn a place within it. The hallway where I had been seated was unchanged, the chair still there, the space still narrow and unremarkable, and yet standing there again, I felt no shame, only clarity, because this was the truth, unadorned and undeniable. When the photographer arrived, there was no awkwardness, no need for lengthy explanation, just a shared understanding that something important was about to be captured, not for spectacle, but for record. I took my seat once more, not as someone hiding, but as someone claiming the space for what it represented. And as the camera clicked softly, I held myself with the same composure I had been forced to summon earlier, except now it was chosen, not imposed. The contrast between elegance and neglect, between presence and exclusion, was stark. And that contrast was the point, because nothing exposes injustice more clearly than seeing it framed honestly. There was no need for instructions about expressions or poses, no need to exaggerate pain, because dignity in the face of disregard tells its own story. And as the session continued, I felt something close to peace settle over me, the kind that comes from knowing that the truth, once recorded, cannot be erased. When it was over, there was no sense of triumph or relief, only a calm certainty that what had been hidden would remain hidden no longer, that the narrative had shifted from whispered explanation to visible fact. I thanked the photographer, gathered my things, and left the venue for the final time, carrying with me not anger, but resolve. Because I knew that the most difficult part of this was yet to come, not the creation of evidence, but its arrival in the world that had tried so hard to look away. Back in my quiet space, I reflected on how easily stories are shaped by those with the loudest voices or the most polished images, and how fragile those stories become when confronted with something real, something unedited. I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone, wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply refusing to carry the burden of silence any longer. And in doing so, I felt lighter than I had in days. The truth, when handled with care and intention, has a way of speaking for itself. And I trusted that it would reach exactly the people it needed to reach, without my intervention. Because once the images were released, once the reality of that chair and those bins entered the same social world that had celebrated the wedding, the story would no longer be about a perfect day. It would be about what it cost to keep certain people out of sight, and that revelation would change everything. Have you ever watched a carefully built image collapse? Not with a crash, but with a whisper that spreads until everyone hears it? That is how it began, quietly, almost invisibly, the moment the truth stepped into the same social circles that had so eagerly celebrated perfection. Because once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. The images moved faster than explanations ever could, passed along not with commentary at first, but with stunned silence, with pauses, with the kind of disbelief that forces people to look again, and then again until the question formed on its own. Why was the mother there? Why was she hidden? Why did no one say anything? Conversations shifted, not in public statements or confrontations, but in private messages, in group chats, in whispered exchanges over coffee, where admiration turned into discomfort. The wedding that had been praised for its elegance was suddenly being discussed for something else entirely. Something no amount of justification could polish away, and the absence of an easy explanation only sharpened the impact. Those who had once admired the spectacle began to distance themselves, not out of loyalty to me, but out of instinct, because association with cruelty, once visible, becomes dangerous to maintain. My daughter's calls came in waves, frantic and raw, her voice swinging between anger and panic, demanding to know why, how, what I had done, as if truth were an act of aggression rather than a record of reality. And each time I listened quietly, responding only when necessary, refusing to be pulled back into a dynamic where I was expected to absorb blame to protect someone else's comfort. The social world she had worked so hard to enter proved itself as conditional as her treatment of me, welcoming when everything looked right, unforgiving when it didn't. And watching that unfold, I felt no satisfaction, only a sobering clarity about the cost of building a life on appearances alone. Invitations slowed, messages went unanswered, assumptions were made, and without a single confrontation, her standing shifted from admired to questioned, from enviable to uncomfortable, because people may tolerate many things, but public evidence of disrespect toward a parent unsettles even those who prefer not to get involved. The narrative changed not because anyone defended me loudly, but because silence now worked in my favor, allowing the images to speak without interference, leaving no room for denial or spin. Financial pressures followed social ones, because image and opportunity are often intertwined, and when confidence erodes, so do the relationships built on it, creating cracks that spread into every corner of life. Through it all, I remained where I had always been, tending to my days, speaking little, watching from a distance as the consequences of choices I did not make unfolded on their own. And in that distance, I felt something unexpected, a sense of release. I was no longer carrying the weight of explaining, defending, or justifying my own existence, because the truth had stepped in and taken over that work for me. The world she had wanted so desperately to impress revealed itself as shallow and unforgiving, quick to celebrate success and quicker still to withdraw when flaws appeared. And seeing that, I understood that the humiliation I had endured was not an anomaly, but a symptom of values that prioritized perception over people. The calls eventually slowed, replaced by messages heavy with regret and confusion, apologies tangled with self preservation, and I listened without responding, not out of cruelty, but because I had already said everything that needed to be said by allowing the truth to exist unfiltered. I did not feel vindicated, only affirmed, because what I had reclaimed was not revenge or validation, but my own narrative, no longer distorted by someone else's fear of judgment. As days passed and the initial shock settled into a new reality, I realized that the most powerful shift had not occurred in her world, but in mine, because I was no longer defined by the role she had tried to assign me. And as the noise began to fade and the fallout settled into something quieter and more permanent, I understood that the final chapter of this story would not be about what they lost, but about what I finally regained. Have you ever realized that the end of a story isn't marked by noise or victory, but by the quiet moment you stop waiting for someone else to change? That realization came to me slowly, not as relief, but as peace, the kind that settles in when you finally understand that closure does not require reconciliation, only acceptance. When the calls stopped and the messages faded into silence, I returned fully to the life I had left behind, to the rhythms that had always sustained me before I began measuring my worth through someone else's eyes. Back home, the mornings were gentle again, the air carrying familiar scents, the kind that remind you who you were before disappointment tried to rewrite you. And as I moved through my days, tending plants, preparing meals, watching the light change across the yard, I felt something steady rebuild itself inside me. The humiliation that once felt overwhelming no longer defined me, because humiliation loses its power when it is acknowledged, understood, and then released. And I had done all three without shouting or pleading. I thought often about the choices I had made as a mother, about the sacrifices I had offered freely, and I understood now that love given sincerely is never a mistake, even when it is not returned in the way you hoped. What changes is not the value of the love, but the boundaries you place around it. And those boundaries, once drawn, brought clarity I had never known before. I did not rewrite the past or pretend the pain hadn't happened, but I refused to let it harden me, because bitterness would have been another form of loss, another way of allowing that day to take something from me. Instead, I chose to remember who I had always been, a woman shaped by work, faith, patience, and dignity, and to let that identity guide me forward without apology. I no longer wondered if I had done enough or been enough, because the answer was clear in the life I had built and the values I continued to live by. Values that did not require validation from anyone who could discard me so easily. In moments of reflection, I recognized that the true legacy I carried was not land or money or even motherhood, but self respect, the kind that survives disappointment and emerges intact, stronger for having been tested. That legacy was mine to keep, to model quietly, without explanation, for anyone who cared to notice, and it was enough. The story others told about that wedding eventually faded, replaced by new conversations, new spectacles, because the world always moves on, but my understanding of myself remained grounded and unshaken. I did not seek updates or explanations, did not reopen wounds in the name of resolution, because I had learned that peace often arrives when you stop revisiting places that only echo with what might have been. Standing in my own space, surrounded by the life I knew how to nurture, I felt whole again, not because everything had worked out, but because I had reclaimed the authority to define what mattered to me. The woman who once sat quietly beside what was meant to be discarded was no longer invisible, not because others suddenly saw her, but because she finally saw herself clearly. And in that clarity, I found the ending I hadn't known I needed. One built not on revenge or regret, but on the quiet, unbreakable truth that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken away. Because they thought the story ended when I was hidden, but in reality, that moment was only the beginning of the life I chose to live on my own terms. And that choice was my greatest victory.